right, my friends, welcome to Nostalgia Trap. My name is David Parsons. I am more than excited to kick off this trilogy of episodes with my good friend Justin Rogers Cooper. We are taking a detailed look at the life, work, and legacy of someone who probably needs no introduction, particularly to people who listen to this show. But we're talking about Noam Chomsky for the next 3 episodes. Chomsky is obviously someone who has been a towering figure in the American left, and also, for Justin and I, someone who's been a touchstone, someone who we've been reading and thinking about and listening to for many, many years. I think I've probably told the story a million times on Nostalgia Trap of my first encounter with Noam Chomsky, which was through going to a head shop / record store in my hometown. I was probably 19 years old in Ventura, California, a place called Wild Planet that sold bongs and Jimi Hendrix posters, but they also had a little Noam Chomsky politics section in which they had tapes and CDs and books, and I always wondered who that guy was and why all these freaks were into him. And that set me off into the world of the left and something I really had no contact with when I was younger. So I hope you enjoy these episodes. We really went into it in the same way that we went into Howard Zinn last year. I think there were a lot of sort of unexpected surprises in looking at these figures in detail, particularly just their lives. I knew a little bit about their work, obviously, and their points of view on politics and history, but finding out about their biographies and how that connects has been really, really intense and instructive. I hope you enjoy this stuff. So like I said, this is part 1. The first episode is me and Justin talking about Chomsky's childhood, the history he was born into, the people he was surrounded by, and his first years of becoming a graduate student and getting involved in politics and history. So this is, I think, Chomsky's life all the way up until the 1960s when he makes his break with the university and joins the Vietnam anti-war movement. In part 2, we talk about Chomsky's work, particularly manufacturing consent and his contributions to our understanding of media. And then in part 3, Justin and I go full doomer and take a look at the apocalypticism of Chomsky. He talks a lot about nuclear war, space weapons, climate change. And we wanted to sort of put that into perspective, particularly as Chomsky's in the later years of his life. He's currently 93 years old, and what he's telling us and how that is either a continuity or a break with what he's been telling us for decades. So again, this was a real eye-opening experience, even for someone who, I thought I knew Chomsky, but I ended up learning a whole lot here. I hope you enjoy these conversations. This is part 1. Parts 2 and 3 are for Nostalgia Trap subscribers only. You can do that at patreon.com/nostalgiatrap if you're not subscribed already, and you will get access to that whole Howard Zinn trilogy and all the other stuff we've been up to for years. So I hope you enjoy this. This is me and Justin Rogers Cooper talking about the one and only Noam Chomsky. Well, okay, Justin Rogers Cooper, the moment has finally arrived after years of you and I having conversations, dancing around the topic. It's time we take on a towering figure of the American left. I think, honestly, maybe you'll disagree, but I can't think of a bigger figure in the American left, honestly, than Noam Chomsky, the subject of our journey over the course of these next 3 episodes. I can't tell you how excited I am to finally talk about Chomsky directly with you, Justin. So thank you for joining me. Are you up to this monumental task?
I thought we were here to talk about Seinfeld. What? No, just
fuck.
joking. Just joking. Yeah, I'm so excited, man. And we had so much fun last year with the Zen trilogy and the 9/11 trilogy. So the idea that I can sink my teeth into kind of like a multi-arc project here with you on someone like Chomsky is thrilling. On the other side of it, I sent you a picture a moment ago of like the stack of books that I've assembled to prep for this thing, and
it's insane.
It's not even a majority of the books. So I think we need to have some kind of caveat here where it's kind of like you can't you can't really tackle the scope of this person's intellectual production in 3 podcasts.
Well, that's what I was trying to think of. Like, what are we calling this? Is this I think of it as kind of an intellectual biography, maybe a critical appreciation, a group of lessons. I think this is similar. This will be similar, I think, in structure at least, if not revelation, to the Howard Zinn trilogy we did, which, that was another figure that was really influential in my own thinking, but I'd never really considered him that deeply before, particularly putting the biography next to the legacy. So that'll be interesting. And it's funny, we were just talking before we turned the mics on. I just watched that manufacturing consent documentary, and we'll talk about that in more detail, I think, in future episodes. But that documentary, it had a major effect on me, and that was in the 2000s. Whenever I watched that, I'm realizing that documentary was done in 92. They were doing a retrospective of this guy's life in his mid-60s. And like you said, it's he had an extraordinarily complete life by that moment. And yet 30 years have gone by, and he's still been producing the entire time.
Yeah. I believe he was born in 1928. And so he's getting up there. And I could be wrong on the year. I should actually check the article.
Yeah, it's December. He was born in...
28
on December 7th, 1928. Yep.
So, he's been around for a century, and it's kind of amazing to think back to that manufacturing consent moment for the reason that you just described. But I also would draw a parallel, as we begin here, to Zen, not just because that's a subject that he's a subject that we looked at, in detail last year, but also because Zen and Chomsky were contemporaries and also have a kind of similar vibe, which is to say Zen and Chomsky are people you read in high school and in college. You're not really allowed to cite them in serious academic scholarship. And both of them had something to say about that. And one of the things that both of them had to say is that they really felt that they were talking to sort of a variety of people, including people outside the sort of formal educated milieu. And they also really resented a lot of the posturing and posing and sort of overcomplicatedness of academia. And so in a very campus trap kind of way, Zen and Chomsky are perfectly fine not headlining sophisticated academic conferences. They felt more comfortable in many senses talking to a small group at a church about the peace movement. And I think that when we register the sort of absurdity of how those figures aren't taken seriously by a lot of the people probably in our kind of professional network, if not our friend network, I think that's a good place to put it. Or a good place to put our initial mark down. And I'll just say one thing there. Mm-hmm. One of the lines that that caught me that I wanted to quote here at the beginning was early on in that biography by Robert F. Barsky that you pay attention to in your article for that Peace Encyclopedia. This is A Life of Dissent. Chomsky says that he's always been on the side of the losers. And I think that's a really key quote. And I think that connects into Zen in a certain way, the kind of people's history type aspect of things. But I also think that kind of I wouldn't call it even necessarily a punk ethos, but there's that kind of underdog mentality. Reminds me of you, kind of reminds me of this show. There's this 1 foot in academia, but you're also kind of putting your middle finger up under the table, if you will.
Yeah.
If that makes sense.
Yeah, definitely. And I mean, we'll get into this in his biography, but it's very much like Zen in the sense that the Vietnam War was a dividing line for them because they were in the academy and they witnessed that the Vietnam War was constructed and implemented by liberal academics, and that really bothered them, right? And they didn't want to be a part of it, and that was a separation point. So, I want to get to that. I love that you mentioned his childhood, and you mentioned the Peace Encyclopedia thing. Let me just set that up for people that don't know what you're talking about. I wrote I was asked for some reason to write a couple of entries in this Peace Encyclopedia that's a big volume. It's the history of anti-war and pacifism, terms and people and all that sort of thing. And so I wrote the Noam Chomsky, I wrote the Jane Fonda, and a couple of other entries. And it really took me some time to kind of condense. Writing an encyclopedia entry is so weird because you're really meant to sort of condense it down to the broad strokes. So anyway, I have that in front of me, and I think it'll be a document that we can dip into just in terms of the basic outlines of this guy's life and where Chomsky comes from. He was like Justin just mentioned. Noam Chomsky was born in Philadelphia on December 7th, 1928. At the age of 27 years old, he earned a doctorate from Harvard University's Society of Fellows. And since 1955, he's been a professor in MIT's Department of Linguistics, retiring in 2017. He's become a significant figure in the field of linguistics and for his contributions to the development of several important linguistic theories, including the universal grammar theory, the Chomsky hierarchy, and the minimalist program. Chomsky earned the nickname the father of modern linguistics. So there's a lot there in terms of just his first 30 years of life. But one thing that comes out in the documentary and any interviews with Chomsky over the years is he doesn't like to talk about his biography too much, as opposed to the thrust of this show, which is often trying to connect people's biographies to their politics and all that sort of thing. Chomsky's real, he's kind of like, well, none of that matters. It's all just kind of incidental. But there are a couple things in his childhood that do stand out. And I wonder if we can sort of think about them in terms of the historical era he was born into and the people he was surrounded by. And there's one story that I want to tell just right on the outset, and maybe you can add some more color to this, Justin, is that he tells this story that's in the documentary about standing up for a kid that was getting bullied at his school when he was in like the first grade. And he says in the interview, he's used the term fat kid, which is really interesting considering all this like body positivity and like fat shaming and that discussion that's in culture now. But this is the 90s, and he's telling this story, and he says there was a fat kid in first grade. He had been the target of malicious bullies. They were beating him up, and they were there was a kid from third grade that was going to come that was bigger, that was going to beat him up, and I felt a sense of responsibility to stand next to him. And I stood next to this kid, and I kind of wanted to protect him from the bullies. And he's like, I felt just a natural sense of justice here that I felt like I should protect him because he was the underdog. But he's like, but then the bullies came and I ran away. And he's like, the shame I felt. And he's like, and I was right to feel ashamed. He's like, the shame I felt has never left me. And so when I think about my politics, he's like, maybe there's something there. You can, I'm not a psychoanalyst. You can do what you want with that. But I thought that was really interesting. And you talk about me and you, Justin, in this show, and that kind of punk ethos of like hating authority and hating bullies in particular. I mean, that's entirely my experience of being a child was, being subjected to malicious violence from childhood bullies and wanting that. I mean, I can honestly say of all the books I've read and everything else, there's plenty of things that have formed my personality and who I am and my values and outlook on life. But that experience of being bullied as a kid is something that has informed my sense of outrage and justice and sense of like pulling for the underdog too. So I really identified with Chomsky with that, and it linked up with Zinn getting beat up by the cops too. So there's something important there.
Well, there's that, side of the losers thing. And I think that the Zinn moment you're referring to, which I think you were right to bring up to me recently, was when he was a kid and he fell in with some commies and they went to Times Square or something. Mm-hmm. And the cops just charged everyone like at 10 p.m. He was knocked unconscious, woke up in a doorway and was like, what the fuck? I thought this was a free country.
Right.
And so I think that was a 30s, 40s moment for Zinn.
All 30s stuff. Yeah.
And, that's one other thing they have in common is they both kind of came of age during the Depression. Now, Chomsky came up of age in Philly, where Zinn was in Brooklyn. And, I'll just note briefly because I don't think we'll have time to get into it, but one of the ways that Chomsky was radicalized was as like a kind of early adolescent. He often took, I believe, the train up to New York, where he had an uncle who ran like an unsuccessful newsstand, but which nonetheless was like the center of like intellectual networking and commentary. And he like learned a lot about kind of left socialist and anarchic thought, like kind of on the fly, kind of absorbed it like a sponge. And I think it was near 72nd Street, actually, on the Upper West Side.
It
like,
is. It's a
way
72nd Street.
pre Seinfeld.
One of the last like standing subway houses in Manhattan, as I understand it, as I recall.
Yeah, and so you could picture, like, there must have been some overlap with Zen in that decade. I'm sure some of the guys at that newsstand knew one of the guys that Zen knew, kind of a thing. Now, the thing that I want to make a direct connection to is another story from his childhood, and this comes up when Chomsky's reflecting on, Philadelphia during the Depression, and he says that some of his early childhood memories included seeing people coming to the door and trying to sell rags or apples, and traveling in a trolley car past a textile factory where women were on strike and watching riot police beat the strikers. Oof. I think that idea of the police beating people that were kind of standing up for justice and also getting bullied by the cops isn't a direct connection to what you were just saying, right?
Oh, yeah, right. Yeah.
And he goes on and he says, I thought this was interesting. The neighborhood in which Chomsky's family lived was inhabited mainly by Germans and Irish Catholics, who were for the most part anti-Semitic and pro-Nazi. Not all children raised under such circumstances develop a social conscience. And this is Barsky talking now. But it's fair to say that Chomsky, who was immersed in an alien cultural tradition within a community of immigrants, had many occasions to stare hypocrisy and violence in the face and wonder about their sources. And I just also think it's worth noting that Chomsky comes from kind of like a radical Jewish family, and like radical in different kinds of ways, like a family tree that had leftists and communists in it. But his father, if I remember correctly, was actually like the principal of a Hebrew school. And they were kind of like middle class liberal Zionists, but I'm going to stress here a strange kind of Zionism. They were radical, sort of socialist-y, lefty Zionists before the establishment of the state of Israel. And early on in his life, one of the things that comes up that we may or may not even have time to talk about, even though later we might want to get into like the attack by Dershowitz on him and his like the kind of like 80s, 90s era accusations of like anti-Israel, anti-Zionist, attacks.
It gets ugly. It gets super
ugly
ugly
later in his life. Yeah. Kind of mixed up with that affair that you wrote about, which we can probably get to at some point. But it is worth mentioning that, Chomsky had and grew up in a kind of religious and like Jewish family and environment, understood Hebrew to a really special degree. In fact, one of his early works is on like the Hebrew language, or maybe he like absorbed that with his dad. I might be, kind of misremembering a little bit there. But there's one other thing that I wanted to bring up.
And he studied Arabic as well, which is really interesting to me, is that he's learning because part of what that brand of Zionism you're describing, that like left socialist, pre-Israel Zionism, is very much about like Jewish Arab cooperation. At least that's how he puts it. And to me, like the vision of that sort of like cross-ethnic, cross-religious solidarity,
binational state.
Yeah, but it's also located for Chomsky in language, that he's studying the Hebrew language, he's studying Arabic, he's sort of trying to understand all sides. I think that's kind of interesting because he's going to go into linguistics. I mean, he's going to eventually say that there's no connection between his study of linguistics and his politics, but I'm always trying to see it because it seems like from the very beginning, language and culture is a way in for him to understand some sort of universality.
That's well said. And we could speculate there that some of that universality, at least in terms of his political work and political life, also overlaps with Zen, who was very interested in a universal kind of solidarity, transnational constructions of social movements and struggles, and kind of, I would say Chomsky seems a lot less invested in a sort of fetishization, if you will, of the working class as like the group of people who needs to foment like the transnational like revolution or something, in part because I don't think he's committed to revolutionary politics and that kind of like Marxist-Leninist tradition. But also, having said that, you do detect in his work the discourse of workers a lot. And so I think it is worth preserving that Chomsky focuses on workers with a different emphasis than like sort of classical Marxism, possibly even a different emphasis than Zen, although that's debatable. And the way that I want to locate that here, at least for a little bit in this episode, and then pick up on it in the next couple, is that in addition to whatever else we're going to say about Chomsky, the thing I really want to locate is like his particular philosophy of like anarchism, or what's called anti-authoritarian socialism or libertarian socialism. Interesting terms, kind of a little bit interchangeable, but not necessarily. And one of the ways the reason I'm bringing it up is because it blossoms when he's a little kid, not much older than my son Conrad. And this story that it popped up in the book on anarchism. This is the only deviation from the biography by Barsky.
Is this him writing about the Spanish Civil War when he's 12 years old?
When he's 10.
He's
and,
10.
You know, and I think it's a lovely anecdote because it sticks with him and it forms his political consciousness for the rest of his life. And it definitely influenced like his reading of Orwell and Bertrand Russell and like other kinds of like figures on the left in that tradition. And it also heavily influenced him as far as like how he did not end up ever becoming like a pro-Bolshevik. He was a kind of against Leninism, and he was you can fold all that into what he calls his anti-Stalinism, and he refers to Stalin a lot.
Chomsky isn't just get it out of the way. Chomsky is like an anti-tanky. And sort of, I don't know if you would call him, I don't know if you would describe him as anti-communist. I don't think that's the right term, because anti-communism has its own sort of tradition in politics, particularly in the United States. But he's not a tanky, and he's not a pacifist either. And I think some of this comes out through World War II. So we can get that, because I think that, I can't help thinking about Zinn being like a bombardier, like literally, dropping bombs in World War II, and Chomsky's in the academy at the same time that's happening, and he doesn't go to war, and their experiences are really different, and they end up having different sort of attitudes, because Zinn ends up being a pacifist, and Chomsky's not. Chomsky doesn't really embrace that.
Yeah, well, he's not a pacifist, and he's anti-war, and that's a contradiction to be explored. But in this early episode, because you don't often get the memories, I just want to like share this with you. He's asked in this interview with Harry Kreisler in the On Anarchism book, hey, you wrote that first essay on the Spanish Civil War as a 10-year-old. And Chomsky's reply is, I'm not sure I'd want to read it today. But he explains, I remember what it was because I remember what struck me. This was right after the fall of Barcelona. The fascist forces had conquered Barcelona, and that was essentially the end of the Spanish Civil War. And the article was about the spread of fascism around Europe. So it started off by talking about Munich and Barcelona and the spread of Nazi power, fascist power, which was extremely frightening. So you have this like anti-fascist kid, which I just think is such a cool idea. But he continues, and just bear with me because this is the last thing I want to put forward on this part. But I'll be picking up on this in future episodes. So he says, just to add a little word of my personal background, we happen to be, for most of my childhood, the only Jewish family in a mostly Irish and German Catholic neighborhood, sort of lower middle class neighborhood, which was very anti-Semitic and quite pro-Nazi. It's obvious why the Irish would be. They hated the British. It's not surprising the Germans were anti-Semitic. I can remember beer parties when Paris fell, which is kind of a stunning memory. And the sense of the threat of this black cloud spreading over Europe was very frightening. I could pick up my mother's attitudes, particularly she was terrified of it. And then he continues, and I think, well, I want you to remember like the story you told me, because listen to this. It was also my personal life because I saw the streets. Interesting. For some reason, which I do not understand to this day, my brother and I never talked to our parents about it. I don't think they knew we were living in an anti-Semitic neighborhood. But on the streets, you go out and play ball with kids or try to walk to the bus or something. It was a constant threat. It was just the kind of thing you knew for some reason not to talk to your parents about. To the day of their death, they didn't know. But there was this combination of knowing that this cloud was spreading over the world and picking up, particularly that my mother was very upset about it. My father too, but more constrained. And living it in the streets in my own daily life, it made it very real. So like he's growing up among fascists, and he's growing up among white fascist immigrants that are German and Irish. I think that's really interesting. And just bear with me because I'll quit here. I won't subject you to too much more of this.
Maybe this explains why he doesn't have a romance for the working class.
or yeah. Yeah, he doesn't use that language. He uses the language workers, but not working class.
Right.
Okay, and so he goes, anyhow, by the late 30s, I did become quite interested in Spanish anarchism and the Spanish Civil War, where all of this was being fought out at the time. Right before the World War broke out, the kind of microcosm was going on in Spain. And I think we both acknowledge that, but I just think it's worth preserving. And he continues, by the time I was old enough to get on a train by myself around 10 or 11, I would go to New York for a weekend and stay with my aunt and uncle and hang around at anarchist bookstores down around Union Square and 4th Avenue. I just thought that was cool because that's where me and you used to hang out. And he continues, there were little bookstores with emigres, really interesting people. To my mind, they looked about 90. They were maybe in their 40s or something. And they were interested in young people. They wanted young people to come along, so they spent a lot of attention. Talking to these people was a real education. And I think that's part of what we said at the opening, that what he considers a real education was talking to leftist intellectuals in the Lower East Side, in the 30s and 40s, like about left ideas outside the university, in New York City, back when it was this radical city. And so he continues, and then I'll just summarize this. I won't read it. He goes on and we'll pick up with this later, to kind of contest what the term libertarian means to the right and the left. And then he kind of he spends a lot of time kind of redefining what anarchism is on the left. And just one thing that I thought was like totally a cool nostalgia trap moment was when he's kind of working through his understanding of like what the actual anarchist history is. He goes back to the 1850s and he starts talking about the Industrial Revolution in Eastern Massachusetts, sort of around where he is in MIT at that time, and like the textile plants. And he starts talking about the young women coming off the farm and the factory girls. And some of them were Irish, some of them were immigrants in Boston. And he starts complimenting the rich and interesting culture that those workers had, those young women who worked in the factories had. And he mentions that they didn't bother with European radicalism. It didn't have an effect on them, that they were part of this general literary culture, but they developed their own conceptions of how the world ought to be organized. And what I think is really important about that is, and we can get into this later, not in this episode, but in the second and third, is that he makes a connection between 1930s Spain and 1850s Massachusetts, because to him, what anarchism is it's a kind of like worker organized political culture that's about solving problems with creativity in their immediate sort of neighborhood and their immediate milieu. And it's about people coming together and struggling to make changes that will make their lives better, make their lives easier. And so you can see that 1850s moment is often claimed in like more straightforward, Howard Zinn style histories of like leftism and socialism. And Chomsky's saying, no, that's anarchism too, the way he sees it. And I think that's really, really important because it shows the kind of birth of this thinking about this anarchist tradition. And it also shows that he's making novel connections about a history of the left that I think me and you are actually a lot of the time sympathetic to. And I just want to underscore that because we've had our own problems with tankies and we've had our own problems with parties. And I think that when me and you are casting about for a kind of like anti-authoritarian socialism, and when me and you kind of have the value of saying, hey, there are some like liberal or libertarian freedoms that we want to preserve and reserve as like part of a left tradition that's the outcome of popular struggle by workers and other kinds of people, that we want to honor what was fought for and won in a country like the US, not in an exceptionalist sense, but in the sense that Chomsky is referring to as part of a transnational culture of people fighting and struggling, not just a US culture of people fighting and struggling. That I think I just think it's not coincidental that we're returning to Chomsky at this moment in terms of like how me and you have organized our own like creative evolution of thinking on this program, if you will.
And it resonates with a lot that I'm thinking about right now, and I've mentioned on the show a million times. I think the 1936-37 Flint sit-down strike in Michigan that ended up with a sort of the General Motors being entered into, the United Auto Workers and the union ended up with like union membership for auto workers. That's the end of that story. But the story itself is one that includes both shades of what you're describing there. Both the like kind of, liberalism and moving into like a unions, a position that's bringing them into the fold of the state and all that sort of thing. But there's also what the strike itself had all these beautiful anarchic qualities to it of self-organization and creativity and of people helping each other. And that's where like that's sort of the heart of the story for me, more than like what the legal sort of consequences of all this was with the, union recognition, etc. What it demonstrated was something along the lines of what I think Chomsky is pointing out about Massachusetts there and about the Spanish Civil War, which he brings up a lot. The sort of anarchist experiments during the Spanish Civil War for him are sort of like, I feel like the generation of leftists that come after him had a similar fetishization or concern or obsession even with Cuba, and that they were all going to Cuba, and like that generation
Absolutely.
was all Cuba. Cuba's the place that's the site of inspiration. It's going to be the future. This moment in the Spanish Civil War is that for an older generation of leftists, and I think that's really interesting. I mean, there's quite a difference between those two things, but yeah.
Yeah, it reminds me one of the cast-off things that he said to in this Barsky book was when he was asked about Che Guevara. He said something like, "Oh, I don't have much time for that kind of mindless romanticism."
Wow,
just like,
amazing!
Yeah, it gets to that level, and I'm sure that pisses people off.
Well,
but
go ahead.
Well, I just was going to say that since you brought up that connection between his politics and his linguistic philosophy.
Yeah, for sure. That's where I was headed next.
Yeah,
so
there was this moment in the Barsky biography. I just wanted to hit up that because I thought what you said was pretty right on. And as Barsky and Chomsky are tracing his like intellectual origins actually through, strangely enough, like Descartes and Humboldt and even Adam Smith. It's he quotes Adam Smith a lot sympathetically, which I think is very interesting. And there's more on that in some other episodes.
He actually doesn't use the word capitalism all that much. I mean, for being a guy that's associated with being an anti-capitalist, he uses other words, and we can get into that.
Yeah, and there's a critique there. And before we move on, I have one other critique right after I make this that's real short, which is this is like radical theory for Chomsky, because he thinks that a lot of like radical theory philosophy is just full of truisms, and it's like kind fanciful dressed up language that's covering over like basic common sense shit, which is part of his own, like it's odd. It's part of his own anti-intellectualism. But yet he profoundly believes in the figure and the purpose of the intellectual. So like the intellectual for Chomsky is this contested idea, but he says, here's the basic philosophy: human beings require liberty. And I love that word is being reclaimed by a leftist, because that's a word that like is mostly associated today with like, don't tread on me, so human beings require liberty, and this is an important and a nurturing environment, which makes me think of you. You strike me as someone who likes a nurturing environment in which to express their humanity. And like that's kind of old school language. It's like very humanist. It's very sort of enlightenment driven. And because Chomsky's making those connections himself, I think it's worth saying that part of the reason why Chomsky is the figure that he is that he's kind of, strangely enough, like he is an enlightenment style philosopher who's probably as prolific as people like Adam Smith and Rousseau. And I would even dare say that he'll be read in a couple centuries, the same way that Smith and Rousseau would be. I mean, that's assuming we have a planet left, which we might not.
The end of the documentary is a set of playing cards with all those philosophers, and Chomsky is the last one. They seem to project that same thing.
Well, good point. I didn't know that. So that I guess I'm not stating anything all that original. But what I would say is, let's just preserve one thing before we move on, because I think it's going to come up later, and I think it's a problem in Chomsky's thought, because he does want to stay consistent with how he critiques things like the state and how power works and capitalism. And that is, he mentions over and over, as you just heard, the problem of fascism. So not only in Spain, not only in World War II, but in the streets of Philadelphia, to borrow a phrase from Bruce Springsteen. And so,
that's interesting. Actually,
we've talked about that fascism in the 1930s in Hollywood, in the 40s in Hollywood. We talked about the way that fascism carried through to the LAPD in the work of Weiner and Davis.
Mm-hmm.
We've always been paying attention to a kind of like homegrown fascism, especially when it's kind of like an explicit Nazism. And it's not always an explicit Nazism, but it often is like kind of a racialized white supremacy. Now, the reason I'm drawing my attention to that is, like a lot of other leftist thinkers, there's this attention to, like people's history, right? People make their own history. This is like kind of the overlapping core tenet of Marxism that you can read into Zen and Chomsky and others, in addition to the social historians of the mid and late 20th century. But here's the problem. People make fascism too. And I think one of the dangers that I see a lot, and we've talked about this in Zen, and I would argue it's present in Chomsky, is that they think fascism is a top-down culture.
Mm-hmm.
And there's a lot of people I respect who think that way, and I could be wrong on this actually. And even like I've debated my dad on this recently, and I don't want to.
This is a really important point.
Yeah,
and it comes up a lot in Chomsky's work. Yeah,
yeah, and if my dad's listening to this, I hope I'm not mischaracterizing him. And again, I think he might be right, but part of what he says to me is the people in power bear the ultimate responsibility for instilling false ideas into the masses or into people, getting people to believe bullshit. And that, if you have to adjudicate responsibility, it rests with the people in power, not with like the people who aren't in power. That the people in power have a responsibility that those out of power don't have. He'll concede that people who aren't in formal institutional roles or corporate roles have power and create acts of fascism or create acts of totalitarianism or Stalinism, whatever. He'll concede all that. He'll just say that, at the end of the day, when you're trying to figure out like where to attack, you're punching up. You're worrying about the people in power first and worrying about their kind of paramilitary, minions second. I think
this has been one of the through lines of the criticism of Chomsky's whole theory of the media. Which is a sort of a top-down theory of kind of how the public is managed, and the public is managed through an electronic media that's connected to elites, and basically uses the power of electronic media to marginalize dissenting opinions. I mean, we'll get into all of Chomsky's theories next time because there's a lot there in terms of, I mean, just the media stuff is a lot, and I don't even think the media stuff is really the bulk of his work, honestly. He did a lot with the political economy of human rights that he wrote with Edward Herman, which is like 9,000 pages in the 1970s. It's all about global politics and media too. But one thing that stuck out to me there, Justin, that might get us into the kind of, I don't know, refining exactly what it is that Chomsky thinks about how people are and how they work, and that connection between his linguistic work and all his thoughts about human evolution and what we are. To me, it's almost silly when he says, I don't see any connection between my linguistic work and my politics. He says I try to think of connections, and there's some thin connection, I guess, but they don't really go together. But to me, I'm always thinking, well, God, Chomsky has a very particular ideas about language and about what human evolution is. But there's a point that I in my notes that I wanted to get out here and see what you think about it, because I think it's a pretty key point. Chomsky thinks creativity or the creative impulse is central to humanity. And that what he calls, quote, coercive institutions limit that impulse by turning people into tools or cogs in a machine. And that for Chomsky, an appropriate system for a technologically advanced human species is to maximize the creative impulse in humans and limit coercive systems. Now, he does concede that any system of force or coercion requires justification, and he says most are unjustifiable. And then he does, and this is what I want your reaction from, Justin. He gives two examples of what he calls necessary or acceptable coercion. He says that one example is families need to coerce each other and coerce children in particular. They need to use force sometimes to shape a child and keep them safe and fed and all that sort of thing. So that's one example. The other example that he gave, I think this is amazing, besides families, of necessary acceptable coercion, is that he says American society turned into a totalitarian society during World War II, and that was necessary for the war effort. And I thought, wow, what an extraordinary exception he gives there to his whole theory of I don't like coercive institutions, but the United States government during World War II was acceptable to me in the same way that a parent coercing a child to go to bed at night is acceptable. That's pretty incredible. It made me think a lot.
It's incredible, and I think that it's a testimony to what we just discussed, at least in part, which is that he grew up in a fascist neighborhood. His mother was terrified of the success of the Germans. His neighborhood celebrated when the Nazis successfully invaded France. He witnessed the Holocaust, and contrary to a lot of the kind of Holocaust denial accusations that he had for defending free speech later, the Holocaust had an impact on his thinking. He refers to concentration camps throughout all of his work. So that's one of the main themes of not of this show, of our next show. It's that to him, the camp is a signal event. And me and you have talked about the camp as a way to think about how capitalism organizes itself, even in terms of our Planet of Camps thesis from
That's
our 9/11
right.
trilogy.
It's an end point for us, I think, in a lot of ways. In our imagination, I think of the horror of capitalism, or what Chomsky might call coercive institutions, the state, all those sorts of big, scary things that we locate as parts of the power structure of the world we live in. I feel like the camp, and particularly the death camp, and what we imagine as the Holocaust in World War II, but also camps beyond that. That's sort of that's the nightmare to me, and I think that's the end point for a lot of us. Is sort of that's what makes it such an important thing to sort of highlight, think about, fight against, etc.
Yeah, and to his credit, as you mentioned before, he continued to insist on focusing on the prevalence of camps or camp power. I don't know what you would want to call it. He continued to focus on genocidal regimes throughout his entire life, and he constantly pointed out the ways the United States was itself a genocidal regime at various points and in various places. And I think that for us, it returns to that theme of fascism and anti-fascism, and what you do with this kind of longstanding problem. Obviously, one we're still dealing with, and one that the left is still struggling to navigate, in our opinion, based on our previous shows. And so let's pick up on that, because I think that is also a through line in our nostalgia trap threads.
Oh, yeah.
The camp and fascism.
Well, let's move through some of Chomsky's biography as we're paying attention to the life story here.
Well, and I think because I want to dip back to his time in graduate school, and then focus on that when he gets to MIT, and then we can head towards the anti-war era.
Sure.
I think if we get there, that's a pretty successful bulk of the show,
slice of his life.
Yeah. And so I just wanted to hit what one of the main theses of his language philosophy is, or his linguist philosophy is, because I think some people listening to this, including myself, if I hadn't done some of this research, would have been like, yeah, what's the big deal there again? Because he wrote a dozen books on this subject, and is kind of considered, or was considered, kind of the grandfather of an entire school of thought in linguistics. I'm just going to kind of, late in the Barsky biography, it's summarized this way. It says he was developing a thesis that he had articulated some years earlier, and he was kind of working it out in these subsequent works into the 70s and 80s. And it's this idea that language and other mental abilities should be seen as growing in the individual's mind under genetic control, rather than as learned by organisms lacking any predisposition to develop the particular kinds of mental faculty which are eventually acquired. And I think that's interesting, and the genetic part's very interesting too, and I think important, in part because Chomsky does believe that there are sort of innate structures to how human beings develop, kind of universally.
Yeah, and language is the key to that. For him, he says, if you took a newborn American child and put it in Japan, raised by Japanese parents, it would automatically learn the Japanese language and pick it up, automatically just like any other child would, and it would speak Japanese. His thing is that there's like, to him, a universal set of structures in the mind that language just kind of pops into. To him, it's amazing that children just pick up language. And he uses that as evidence that there are structures of grammar and logic that are in the human mind. And he even says if those are inborn and growing inside, and you're not learned, but actually just like heard, and you just learn language on your own, then that might also mean that it might logically follow that these things also pertain to like moral and aesthetic judgment. That these are beyond language. That there's some sort of universal element of creativity. It's back to that creative impulse as a important part of the human mind. It's funny to see him in that famous debate with Michel Foucault, because he says that he says this to Foucault, that like language is an innate part of humanity, and it demonstrates something important about the universality. And Foucault says, "Fuck you, no, it doesn't." But yeah, it's pretty key stuff. And again, linguistic stuff to me links in with his politics.
Yeah, well, I would probably side with Chomsky in that debate. But one thing that's cool about him and Foucault is they did have some mutual respect. And even though Chomsky's like very famously anti-postmodern in a way that I actually identify with, he reserves respect for some of Foucault's thinking.
That's I think that's why people return to that debate, because it's such a rich sight of seeing two dudes who are like really, locked into their particular viewpoints, really grapple in a respectful way. And
yeah,
it's just kind of amazing to see the two of those guys too.
Yeah, and as we back towards like this 50s moment when he's at the University of Pennsylvania and switches to MIT, and he's at Harvard as that fellowship you mentioned, but I think he also gets his PhD, or he spends a lot of time at University of Pennsylvania too.
Yes.
But I think it's worth, just instead of going through his whole development as a linguist, I think it's just worth capturing the big ideas.
Yeah, definitely. Because I'll say this, I don't really understand it. I mean, I'm not a linguistics guy.
Not on a technical level, but I think the way we're explaining it and the way our reading has explained it, I think that's all people really need to know. But one thing that I think is cool is some of those big problems and you can hear like the kind of Western tradition in Chomsky, is that in the mid 70s, he has this like book, Reflections on Language. And they're part of these like lectures that he was giving at the time, or kind of around that time. And so he has these questions. And I just think these questions are like totally like nostalgia trap questions. So one of the things he thinks about is what he calls Plato's problem, which he thinks about with Bertrand Russell. And he poses the question as, how comes it that human beings whose contacts with the world are brief and personal and limited are able to know as much as they do know? And it's just kind of like this meta question, right? And then the second question he thinks of as Orwell's problem. And I love that he puts Orwell up there with like Bertrand Russell, Plato, and later Descartes, like Orwell. You know what I mean? But I think that's kind of fabulous in a way. And so here's Orwell's problem. And here's the question. How is it that human beings know so little, given the amount of information to which they have access? Which is like a stunning question for our moment right now, considering it's
pre-internet, they're saying that as well, right?
Yeah, exactly. And here's the third question, it's Descartes' problem. How can we account for the many mysteries for humans, or even determine what lies beyond epistemic bounds? And that's like a total nostalgia trap question too. Like, how do we know what we don't know? It's just kind of like, but I think those are just good because they're animating some of like those kind of philosophical linguistic principles that Chomsky was also like really devoted to beyond, or not really beyond, but incorporated with his political work. And I just, that's as far as I would want to go with it. But
totally. I think that sort of wraps up what I wanted to get out of Chomsky's younger years, is sort of the evolution, the growing up with a sense of political, a certain sense of abstract outrage about the underdog, but also as attached to a very particular politics that he was surrounded by, right? You've got the newsstand salon, you've got labor issues. He was particularly, I think, drawn to some family members that were involved in the International Ladies Garment Workers Union, which might link up with what you were describing there in terms of witnessing strikes. But by the time it comes to the mid 1950s, it's the Cold War. Chomsky is one of those people that's we sort of like, I think, dream of and romanticize in some ways in terms of their experience in the academy, because he was like set up at MIT by the mid 1950s. This is
by
the
Roman Jacobson,
right,
like of
right.
all people, like the famous literary critic linguist.
Yeah,
I was like,
there's
what?
actually these amazing clips in the documentary of him sitting next to these intellectuals that are smoking pipes and that have like big like shocks of white hair. I'm like this is like straight out of a fucking novel. But he's in that, and he's in that academic world. I think it's really interesting because, you know, he's not a student radical when Vietnam comes around. He's an establishment guy. He's already like got a family. He's got a house. He's, you know, sort of like taken care of by the system, more or less. And it's the Vietnam War, so I'll read a section of the encyclopedia entry to get us up to speed of what happens to him in the 60s. During the Vietnam War era, Chomsky became known for his outspoken activism against the war, which he regarded as an act of U.S. imperialism. In 1967, he published an influential article, The Responsibility of Intellectuals, in the New York Review of Books. Chomsky attacked American intellectual culture for its ideological support of American military action in Vietnam. Of their own complicity in the war, Chomsky urged academics to consider the question, "What have I done?" is one that we may well ask ourselves as we read each day of fresh atrocities in Vietnam, as we create or mouth or tolerate the deceptions that will be used to justify the next defense of freedom. The article, along with other acts of political protest, brought Chomsky to public attention as one of the leading academic figures in the New Left's movement against the Vietnam War. Over the course of the war, Chomsky was arrested at public demonstrations on several occasions and was one of a number of academics on President Richard Nixon's unofficial enemies list. So, you know, I can tell you that studying the anti-war movement in the 1960s and 70s for my dissertation, eventually my book, Chomsky comes up a lot as a sort of one of the most prominent academics to be against the war, probably the most prominent, honestly, when people were thinking about these professors who are activists. Chomsky was front on the list, and including that enemies list from Nixon, which we know led to Watergate and all that. So you talk about fascism and the state and the intersection. I mean, Chomsky says in 1967, when he started becoming more heavily involved in anti-war activism, his wife, Chomsky's wife, Carol Schatz Chomsky, she went to graduate school. And he said, we made that decision at home because we said you should go to graduate school and pursue an academic career that's sort of as a back burner to support the kids, because I may be headed to prison. So Chomsky was like, Noam Chomsky was ready, and his wife, you know, as a support network, was ready to start taking care of the kids because he felt that his activism was going to lead to jail. So this is, you know, there are a lot of pictures of Chomsky and Zinn together during this moment, because Zinn was also an outspoken radical academic, and the two of them were kind of besties in a lot of ways in the sort of back channels, which is interesting to me too, because their politics aren't exactly aligned, and yet I think they recognize each other in the academy as people who are sort of risking their careers and risking their freedom to sort of point out a very particular angle on the Vietnam War, which was for Chomsky the intellectual element of it, the academic element, the fact that the universities were being contracted into the war effort and were serving as major research laboratories for weapons manufacturers and for people who were actually gaming out the project of attacking Vietnam. So that for him was the line, and it seems like it was the line for Zinn too. Again, war and fascism and ideas of the underdog and violence and bullies is what brought these guys out of the academy to say, we got to do something different here. And I think that's really interesting.
I agree completely. And one of the things that struck me about that anti-war moment, especially his preparation for prison, which I think is insightful on a number of levels, and I think you've spoken to a number of them, appears in the bio. And when they're kind of asking him, well, why didn't you end up in prison? I thought this was an interesting analysis. He says, well, we expected I'd be in jail. within a few years. In fact, that is just what would have happened, except for two unexpected events. Number one, the utter and rather typical incompetence of the intelligence services, which could not find the real organizers of resistance, though it was transparent, and kept seeking hidden connections to North Korea, Cuba, or wherever we must have been getting our orders from. And that reminds me of your recent EP on the kind of Nixon Hoover stuff.
Well, it tracks with my book too. Honestly,
Yeah.
I hate using that word, my book, but my book, Dangerous Grounds, in part is about the U.S. Government's effort to eradicate anti-war activism in the United States. And one of the things that hobbles their efforts is their total obsession with sort of Soviet or even Chinese or some sort of like foreign
sponsorship.
Yeah, foreign sponsorship of the Communist Party, and it's even in like the congressional hearings where these like guys that are literally they're the open operators of anti-war organizations are testifying in front of Congress, and they're like, no, it's just us. We read these books and we're doing these, and they're like, show us your connections to Russia.
Yeah. And in some cases, the guys they've arrested and put on the stand are the wrong guys.
Totally.
They're like, it's not, we're not actually the organizers. But the other thing Chomsky says is, and this reminded me of your book too, actually. He mentions the Tet Offensive, and listen to how he explains it, which convinced American business that the game wasn't worth the candle, and led to the dropping of prosecutions. Meaning, that's just a really interesting analysis, and just
the idea of the Tet Offensive. You're in the sort of Ken Burns type history of what the Tet Offensive is. That's the moment when the American people were lost. That's when the American people no longer believe. But it's also the moment where Walter Cronkite said the war was over, and I love that. It's that there's that like manufacturing consent element of it, because Chomsky's just reading that and being like, well, the business interests who control the media have decided that this is over.
Yeah. Well, yeah. And the other fun thing I read that I really wanted to put out there was his connection with that march on the Pentagon in '67 and how he appears in the Norman Mailer novel Armies of the Night. And I didn't know that. And part of what I found really funny was that he discusses like what it was like to be, out in front of the Pentagon. He was arrested in that march, which I think is just significant from our Nostalgia Trap perspective. And he is kind of remembering what it was like and the flowers going into the rifles. And then he just kind of explains what was going on like in the Pentagon itself. And he goes, Dan Ellsberg later told me, this is like an interesting little aside, that he'd been standing next to McNamara up in the Pentagon somewhere, the two of them ridiculing the tactics of the protesters and talking about how they would have done it more efficiently. And like, that's just such an acid burn and such an interesting anecdote. And it also makes me remember, I don't know if for direct reasons or obvious ones, but maybe they are, that he had a lot of critiques of the 60s campus movements. And that's another way that Chomsky is a kind of idiosyncratic left figure, not only in terms of like an anti-Bolshevik position and an anti-Stalinist, anti-authoritarian socialist position, but also because he's very concerned with tactics and goals. And if he doesn't think that the tactics and goals are aligned, or if the goals aren't consistent with like a kind of like acidic pragmatism, because that's also part of the World War II thing about his support for that kind of the U.S. paternal control of society you just mentioned a few minutes ago. Part of that is just like an acid pragmatism. And by what I mean there is not necessarily LSD acid, but what I mean by that is a kind of
dead alien pragmatism.
Yeah, a real dead alien pragmatism. And like, he's an arch dead alienist. and he it goes back to that camp idea, but part of what I was trying to say there was the Eastern European genocide, but also just the sheer scale of death that was introduced at that point, of which he lived through. He didn't live through World War I, but that's the sheer scale of the mass death made it seem like you'd kind of prefer a version of liberal capitalism to this kind of, Nazi Stalinist world that was emerging, if at least in terms of the Hitler Stalin pact. Prior to June 41, that must have been a scary time if you were already an anti-Stalinist and an anti-fascist, and you're kind of willing to how do you say, I guess you're willing to get blood on your hands in order to take out the monster. Now, notice he doesn't go into some sort of metaphysical, like, we had to defeat the evil. It's not that kind of shit. It's
rarely emotional. He has like you can tell that there's deep emotion. That's why I bring up the bullied kid story, because I'm like, he's rarely emotional. There's something, I think that's part of one of the things that always attracted me to Chomsky. We haven't talked any about that. We'll talk about that during the legacy section, I think, of like what Chomsky means to people. But one of the things he always meant to me, and that I appreciated about him, is sort of his dead alien element. Like there was sort of like just this inarguable rationality to what Chomsky would present always. Whenever it seems like Chomsky's just really, really good at articulating a position and making it seem self-evident and like commonsensical. That pragmatism I think is really important. He's not a doctrinaire guy who's like, this is what we should do. In fact, one of the things that's striking about Chomsky's lecture element of his life, because for a long time he lectures to the public. He goes to campuses, he goes to bookstores, he lectures to the public, and he gives them this sort of devastating critique of what's happening in the world. And a very common thing that happens at these lectures afterwards is during the Q&A, people stand up and they're like, oh my God, like, what do we do? What do we do about this? I am concerned about all these injustices and these things that you've laid out for us. What do we do? And Chomsky's like, I don't know. Like, his question is like, I can't tell you what to do. He's always like, get involved in your community. He doesn't have a particular like, oh, well, you need to, advocate this position and do it this way. He's sort of like, I don't know, he's almost like a kind of outside consultant for different social movements. And it's really interesting because at one point in one of his interviews, it's a antagonistic interview, and this guy says to Chomsky, it seems like you pick and choose who you care about because a dead Palestinian weighs very heavily on your soul, but a dead Kurdish person doesn't seem to weigh heavily on you at all. And Chomsky's like, first of all, I'm not Amnesty International. I can't cover everybody. But the other part of it is bullshit. I have given and thought about and worked with Kurdish organizations many, many times in my life. And he talks about the actual like going to work with Kurdish organizations where he sits and talks with them about strategy and about like sort of what to do. It's really interesting to me that that's an element of his career. Like you said, it's like he'll go sit in a church with some group that's trying to do something for its pro-democracy, and he'll just listen and talk to them and give them some hints of like what's happened in the past and what might work now. And he's not really, I don't think he's really constrained to a particular political program.
It's interesting to hear you say all this because it strikes me that one of the contradictions of his life is that he's like an anti-state, anti-institutional guy who's also like deeply woven into MIT. And he has a take on that too. And if you back up a few years from before the war, you can see that Chomsky was already fighting battles. He was fighting battles at Harvard. He was fighting his own battles in the field of linguistics, including at Pennsylvania. But when he gets to MIT, after he's kind of roped in and starts doing linguistics, like I believe in the electrical engineering department, like it's a weird moment because you can just waltz into a job like that in ways that very, very campus trappy. But one of the things that immediately comes up is that while he's at MIT in the 50s, and he's working for the Research Laboratory of Electronics, which is just so insane. He's developing one of his first works, Aspects of the Theory of Syntax. And it says the funding for the research published in Aspects was provided by the Joint Services Electronics Programs, which is U.S. Army, Navy, and Air Force, the Electronics System Division of the U.S. Air Force, and the National Science Foundation, the National Health Institutes of Health, and NASA. So he's getting money from the state and he's getting money from the defense industries. And like what I find interesting about this in any number of senses is this kind of like sponsorship by elite defense institutions, which we noted you guys noted in the Doors EP that they were products of the defense industry,
That's
including
right.
Jim Morrison.
Yeah.
We've talked about this a lot on the show, the ways that like the cultural contradictions that are embedded in kind of capitalist authoritarian
How about
structure.
Howard Zinn literally dropping bombs with his hand on the lever? I mean, all of this, I think, you know, in a lot of ways made people think a lot about sort of their own complicity in it. And yeah, in this sense, it's like Chomsky's work is entirely supported by the state.
Yeah, and when asked about that later in life, he kind of gave like an acid Chomsky reply, and he was like, "Does everybody shit on Marx because he did his work in the British Library and was sponsored by Ingalls, who was a manufacturing industrialist from a manufacturing industrialist family?"
Canceled.
Yeah, exactly. So, but it comes up later because, and this is I've done some research for this series here, and there are a couple anecdotes come up over and over, and yes, there's a lot of repetition in these books. And a lot of like just switching and changing the chapters from one to another. But they're,
Sure.
But one of the things that keeps coming up is the fact that the Pentagon and NASA were financing 2 MIT laboratories in the 60s, like during the war. And one of them is now called Draper and the other one Lincoln. And they were kind of involved in manufacturing like guidance systems, I guess, for missiles or weapons, and also like tactics for counterinsurgency. This is like part of the MIT's like core mission and rationale, and also funding. And this obviously like created a war on campus among different factions.
Right. Yep.
And I think that Chomsky's take here is worth pointing out because it's like a consistent part of his whole like life experience and how it merges with the kind of intellectual he is. And I think it kind of gives insight into that World War II thing you mentioned a little bit. And it says that Chomsky said that it was impossible for MIT and its researchers to sever ties with the military industrial complex and continue to function. Meaning, if you sever those ties, the university collapses. Okay, so, and he goes on. What he proposed, he stands by today. Universities with departments that work on bacterial warfare should do so openly by developing departments of death. His intention was to inform the general population of what was going on so that individuals could make informed and unencumbered decisions about their actions. And so then there's this Pounds committee that comes out of MIT. So like we're going to have a committee look at the issue. And here's what happens. The students and I submitted a dissident report disagreeing with the majority. The way it broke down was the right-wing faculty wanted to keep the labs. I love this. The liberal faculty wanted to break the formal relations and put the labs like into like an off-campus like subsidiary of MIT so that it wasn't officially part of the university, but it was still going on. And the radical students and I wanted to keep the labs on campus on the principle that what is going to be going on anyway ought to be open and above board so that people would know what is happening and act accordingly. And he goes, of course, there was resistance to their report from the majority of faculty members, meaning the liberal faculty. This is just so on point. This is like game on to me. And he says, the liberal faculty who were smart enough to understand just what it implied and wanted what amounted to a formal administrative change so that technically the labs weren't part of the institute. Hence, the connections would be invisible. And I just think that is, no matter what you think about Chomsky and the radical student solution, the liberal solution is we want plausible deniability.
That's such an insane story. That's so amazing. And language again, right? They're like, we want to sort of like we don't want to talk about it. Whereas Chomsky is like, well, why don't we just call it what it is? We'll call it the Department of Death Studies, and like you can come in and like, I got a PhD in death, with a master's in genocide, and like that's what he wants to call. I mean, that to me, that's the heart of so much of it. Because in interviews, when people ask Chomsky what should we do, and he talks about, well, you got to educate yourself and you got to get critical and you got to start like looking beyond certain types of media, and you got to begin to free your mind. He doesn't say go to school. In fact, he says don't go to school because you'll never get it there. And I'm like, that's really, really interesting because this guy's, one of the most well-known scholars and academics in American history, honestly. And he's someone who's like, don't go to school. That to me is sort of connects to why Chomsky becomes a punk figure in some way, because he's the guy he is that professor that's sort of undermining the project at the same time he's kind of embodying it. He knows it at an intimate level, and for him, again, it was watching the Vietnam War happen and looking around and being like, God, are we really gonna just like be a part of this in this really, really dramatic, practical way in terms of the operation of the war? And that, I think that Chomsky wasn't naive. He understood where he was already, but I think it was shocking to him and Zinn in a lot of ways to see the depth of it, and it repulsed them, and they began a much more antagonistic position with regards to their own participation in the academy ever since. And it's something I've thought about a lot, entering into being an academic myself, of course, is sort of like, well, what is this institution? What is it for? What purpose does it serve? What powers am I serving, etc.? I got to be honest. They're questions that I would ask of any institution I was involved in. I mean, I've talked about working for a big healthcare company as a sales manager before I went to graduate school. And God, I mean, thinking about the power structures of that company and what it was and how it represented sort of profit in healthcare and all those sort of things was an important way of kind of identifying my own values. So I don't know. I think I identify a lot with what Chomsky has to say about that, and I think this is part of the conversations I'm having with Ryan Boyd on Campus Trap. It's sort of like, what are we doing? And like, we're very ambivalent, and so I think our ambivalence is a product of the contradiction at the heart of the academic thing, which is that it freed our minds. At the same time, it's a coercive institution, to use Chomsky's language.
Well, and remember that tweet you had a few months ago where when the Russia war started with Ukraine, and there was the articles like the California Teachers Union invests in Russian companies, but also remember that whole CalPERS thing? And the thing about CalPERS is you got a huge retirement portfolio of teachers, who are public service workers, and they're all invested in American corporations, and they're all invested in global capitalism. And the teachers retire on the profits of exploitation. And like even in CUNY, it's like there's all. I don't want to make it too personal, but I would just say that, like, number one, the CalPERS dilemma is very much a CUNY dilemma, and number two, CUNY's revenue comes from the state mostly, especially the four-year schools, and to the rest of it's from the city.
Why don't you just say it? It's imperial profit. I mean, that's what 401ks are. I mean, it's like I think it's particularly feels like a contradiction in the academy, because you're like, decolonize your bookshelf, decolonize your 401k, bro.
Yeah, well, and also the direct fiscal spending. In other words, like, the student tuition only pays for 1/3 of the operational costs of the university. All the rest comes from tax money. But of the tax money, 80% plus of all the tax dollars come from Wall Street, come from the richest 1%. So in other words, like, you can say, let's tax the 1%. I totally get it. Let's tax the 1% and bring that money to the university to sponsor public education. I totally get it. I just think that it's worth pointing out that those taxes are off the profits of imperial transnational corporations. That's where the money comes from. So that when Chomsky says, if you take out Draper and Lincoln Labs, you kill the university. In a certain sense, if you abolish Wall Street, you don't have a university the next day, at least not the one that is operational now. I'm not saying I'm for or against that. I'm just saying it names a problem.
It does, it's something I think about when I watch the Berkeley students during the free speech movement and in '64, and they're saying we have to detach the University of California from the nuclear research laboratories and the military industrial complex. And, the university is kind of like, ugh, like, if we do that, we're not really a university anymore. And we're going to have to severely cut how many students we accept each year. Because at the time, Berkeley was, really cheap or close to free. So, yeah, I mean, those are big contradictions that I think about a lot, like how strapped we are to all this ugly capitalism. And it's like, yeah, like, I want to abolish it. And it's like, yeah, but there's also like this sense that our lives are strapped to it. And the structures that we depend on are strapped to it. How do we convert from this without pain? Seems like a big question. It seems like what was Chomsky was asking.
Yeah. Well said. I have two final thoughts.
Yeah. Let's wrap it up because I think that this part right here, this phase of Chomsky's career, in during the Vietnam War, is a kind of transitional moment to what happens to him afterwards, and we can save that for next time. Into the 70s and all the human rights stuff.
I think you're right. Yeah. When he starts getting censored, that's when we can pick up manufacturing consent.
Yeah, totally.
And so my one comment is, it's kind of just a small observation that one of the other kind of battles he struggled with within academia occurred at Harvard in the 50s, I guess before he was at MIT, or this was around the same time period. And that was, I guess it was through the journals too. So it might've been with MIT, but I guess it's one of these Boston battles, Cambridge battles, was he took on B.F. Skinner. It's another one of those like old names. And Skinner was at Harvard. And when Chomsky gets there, there's this behaviorist program that was like at its peak influence at Harvard. And Skinner was like the main person in that program. And like behaviorism is this huge intellectual idea. And here's what I kept thinking of. I kept thinking of chaos. And I kept thinking about
Chaos, the book about Charles Manson and the CIA. Yeah.
But also we know the CIA was connected to Harvard, and like, you know, all those experiments were kind of behaviorist experiments. And so I'm not suggesting anything solid here, but it just listen to this. And I just kind of like, how does Chomsky fit into like a Manson narrative? And this is where it kind of fits in, is that Skinner believed behavior, especially verbal behavior, can be explained and controlled by the same external processes, reinforcement, for example, as those employed to predict and control the behavior of animals. To me, this sounds like chaos. Now, and it continues. In Chomsky's view, this whole theory denied a fundamental characteristic of human behavior, creativity, which allows even young children to comprehend a great variety of utterances when hearing them for the first time. So Chomsky comes out and just starts saying all of behaviorism is bullshit.
Yes.
And this is when Skinner was like peaking his influence.
This is how he made his name, by contrasting himself and ultimately, like, I think overcoming Skinner's theories. Like, essentially, like, I think Chomsky's theories for a lot of people replaced Skinner's theories.
Yes. And so this causes a stir early on. So Chomsky's already kind of like making this name, as you say, early on, and he's taking on Skinner. And I think we need to think more about like the Skinner CIA connection, if there is one. Not that sounds like a tinfoil hat thing to say, but you know what I mean. And so, totally. But here's the end of this point. He later says, like in this interview, 1974, and he says, as far as the Skinner thing is concerned, I think it's a fraud. There's nothing there. I mean, it's empty. It's an interesting fraud. And I love this analysis. He continues, see, I think that there are two levels of discussion here. One is purely intellectual. What does it amount to? And the answer is zero, zilch. I mean, there are no principles there that are non-trivial that even exist. Now, the other question is, and again, I'm thinking of chaos, you know, so Chomsky goes, the other question is, why so much interest in it? And this is where, like, Manson, here's what he says. And here I think the answer is obvious. I mean, the methodology they are suggesting is known to every good prison guard or police interrogator, but they make it look benign and scientific and so on. And they give a kind of coding to it. And for that reason, it's very valuable to them. I think both these things have to be pointed out. First, you ask, is the science? No, it's a fraud. Then you say, okay, then why an interest in it? Answer, because it tells any concentration camp guard that he can do what his instincts tell him to do, but pretend to be a scientist at the same time. And I think that's kind of leading towards an analysis of also, if you believe in behaviorism, how do you produce social control? How do you influence individuals like animals? And all of a sudden you start to get into mind control shit and all the CIA, Harvard mind control experiments. I guarantee there's got to be some fucking level of overlap there.
Yeah, totally. And it links into manufacturing consent too, because media as mind control, he doesn't use that language, but it's definitely there. He feels like that the sort of the theory of the media, the elites using media for control, is exactly a kind of behaviorist model.
Interesting. Well, that is a great connection. We'll pick up on that. Here's the last thing I say. It's much shorter. There's nothing to cite here. And it's what I'm calling like the irony of influence, which is Chomsky sets this whole fucking thing up saying just what you mentioned. What should I do? You decide. Like, Chomsky, tell me about yourself. oh, I'm not interested in a quote unquote personalized framework. Like my life's not important. I don't want to talk about it. And then he makes pains to say, King was Martin Luther King was a product of the institutions that he came up with, that the individuals are sort of pulled out and given all this weight when really it's masses of people putting together struggle and winning like rights and projects. Okay, fine. Mm-hmm. Here's what I'm calling the irony of influence. It's hard to say that there's a larger activist intellectual in the last 70 years than Noam Chomsky. And even for us, in terms of our own biography, we came to his ideas, and those ideas helped form us as intellectuals, as like activists, as thinking people, as creative persons. And I'm not, we would have come to that either way, granted. And the creative population would have come to their things. But in other words, he's not just famous because he himself is ironically a tool of social control, which I would argue later in this series, that Chomsky himself in some ways produces the fiction of a free society, which legitimizes liberal capitalism. In other words, like Chomsky's more valuable out of prison than in prison for this particular kind of
really
system.
Interesting. Yeah.
And but part of what I'm also saying is, but he's also pulled out because he is exceptional. He is profound. He is prolific. He is memorable. And if you let human beings develop their creative expression to their fullest potential, he's this example of that. And he's an example of what's potential in everyone. I think Zen would underscore that too.
And I think Chomsky believes that, and that's an important part of who he is.
But he's also a genius.
Yeah.
And I just think that like he's
saying everyone's a genius, and I'm like, I don't know. We're not all Noam Chomsky.
Yeah, we're not all Noam Chomsky, but I'm just saying it's a complicated problem.
Yeah,
because he's the very thing he denies.
He's exceptional.
Yeah, he's exceptional, and we are all exceptional in a way. But for us who are Nostalgia Trap surveyors of intellectual and cultural ferment in the long scope of history, he pops out. And so at least within our little conversation, he's done such tremendous work that he has a kind of Shakespearean quality to him that on the one hand shows you that there are just like there's tons of Shakespeares that are like stomped out in the gutter every day. Mm-hmm. I think me and you have always believed that. And that's why we stand up. Or maybe that's why we identify with the losers, I guess is a better way to say it too. Yeah. Mm-hmm. That's more accurate than saying Justin stands up for anything. It's more accurate to say Justin identifies with losers. I think that is a truer thing to say, but I think you can feel what I'm getting at here, which is that part of what you have to say about Chomsky's life is that it's a contradiction of his own philosophy. And I think that the more you linger on that, I think actually the more value you can start to extract from that. Yeah. I think that's worth preserving as like a little note to end on from my side.
I think that's great. I'd love to hear what he thinks about that. It's because there are interviewers over the years who try to get at him in terms of thinking about celebrity or how much money he has, or like I see the contradiction that you're identifying there as hypocrisy instead. But I think it's a really important point because Chomsky is something special. At the same time, he's what is special about him is that he's always sort of highlighting this quality that's common to all human beings, and he's also just like so devastating in making arguments, in part because he's good at making things sound like they're self-evident. It's like, well, that's obvious. And anyone who's looked at that for 5 minutes knows it's obvious. And it's like, it's so impossible to like argue with him. And I'll love watching the documentary with you, Justin, for next time, because it's sort of like you see lots of different intellectuals actually trying to come after him, and they sort of like fall apart. There's a great moment where Tom Wolfe, who's, the guy who, speaking of 60s writers and the like Western male tradition, this guy's wearing his like white Mark Twain-ass suit, and he has a very pompous attitude, and he says, "I'm sorry to tell Mr. Chomsky, but the room where the smoky room where all the capitalists are planning the world together like puppet masters, I'm sorry to tell him it just doesn't exist." And it's just like, well, hold on. I mean, I don't think that really characterizes Chomsky's theories very accurately, but also Wolff doesn't really have a counter argument. He just says, like, well, that's silly. And he says that academics are always like clergy. They like to say that something's wrong. And I'm like, okay, like, he doesn't really grapple with the ideas in any way. So it's really interesting to see how people come after Chomsky too. I think it'll be fun to do that as we move forward. Is what are some of the major criticisms that have been thrown his way, because he's someone who remains sort of at the, I mean, I don't think he's been taken down very much. I mean, there are people who go after him, but they usually don't succeed. So that'll be interesting. But this was really fun, Justin. I'm glad we got all the way to the 60s. And next time we'll move through Chomsky's work I think the 70s, 80s, 90s, and beyond is when he becomes much more of a public figure. So it'll be interesting to see how that goes. But thank you for this. This is
sounds
always really
good.
fun. Yeah.
All right. Yeah, fun for me too, man. I'll talk to you soon about it.
Well, okay, I think that's going to do it for part 1 of our Noam Chomsky journey. I want to thank Justin Rogers Cooper, as always, for bringing the passion and the labor to this program. He honestly has so many Chomsky books currently sitting on his desk. I wish you could see them. But I always learn a ton from these conversations, and I hope you do too. And I hope you join us for parts 2 and 3, in which we get into Chomsky's work, his contributions, particularly manufacturing consent, and then part 3, in which we get into climate change and nuclear war and the sort of end of the world vision that Chomsky is more and more professing as he gets older. So all of that has been tremendous, and I hope you join us for it. Patreon.com/nostalgiatrap. Hope you're doing well. We'll talk to you again very soon. Bye-bye.